and welcome to chapter, let's see, what are we on now? How about 30? Learning objective 4. So I wanted to go ahead and record this for you. This is a very new lecture because the Fed has changed a lot of the tools that it has traditionally used. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And there is a hyperlink in here, so I'm really hoping that that hyperlink works. Let's see here. And let me go ahead and start my PowerPoint. Slideshow. Okay, so again, we're just looking at some of the tools that the Fed has available to it. So how does the Fed actually control the money supply? And we're going to look at what happens in each of these tools that the bank uses. So we've discussed fractional reserve banking, and you can see how the Fed can influence the quantity of reserves. So they can change the required reserve ratios. So the two groups of tools, let's start there. The first one is they can use what they call open market operations, which is the buying and selling of bonds. Okay. They can also lend to banks at the federal funds rate. And if they increase that rate or decrease that rate, that will have an impact on the money supply. And we'll look at that in this objective. They can also influence the required reserve ratio. I'm just going to call it RRR, which basically says how much do banks have to hold at the Fed on deposit. Okay, so if they can raise or lower that, and then that will impact the money multiplier. They can also start to change the interest on banking reserves. We call that IOBR. And that's a relatively new tool that we're going to look at in this objective. So open market operations, okay? So the first thing is, when we look at open market operations, if the Fed, okay, so the Fed is doing this, if the Fed sells bonds, essentially what they're doing is exchanging a piece of paper, an IOU. They're selling it to a household, and the household's giving them money. So when a Fed sells bonds, the effect of that is to decrease the money supply. When the Fed decreases the money supply, what happens is it increases the value of a dollar. When it increases the value of a dollar, that decreases the price level. And the price level is just inflation or the CPI. And you can see it's not an exact process. It doesn't start here and end here very quickly. So the Fed has to be pretty precise in these movements. If the Fed decides to buy bonds, then they're taking pieces of paper out of circulation and increasing it with dollars. So this increases the money supply, which will decrease the value of a dollar. It'll take more dollars to buy the same amount of goods, which will increase the price level, or as we've termed it, inflation. Okay, so open market operations is the first one. The second one that the bank can use is they use the discount rate, and this is bank-to-bank lending. So either Fed to a bank or bank to bank. And the Fed doesn't have an unlimited amount of reserves that it can loan out. So first would be borrowing from the Fed. Second would be an auction facility where we have bank to bank, and the interest rate on those types of loans are going to be higher, because just as you and I pay interest, banks have to pay interest to other banks. So in this case, if the Fed decreases the discount rate, then banks will want to increase their amount of borrowing. So that's going to increase the money supply. When they increase the money supply, what's going to happen to the value of a dollar? It's going to decrease. And the price level or inflation is going to increase. If the Fed raises the discount rate, it has the opposite effect. So think about what I'm going to write next. What would be that opposite effect? If the Fed increases the discount rate, makes it more expensive for banks to borrow from others, you're right. It's going to decrease the money supply. It's going to increase the value of a dollar. People are going to want to hold more dollars, and that's going to decrease the price level. So you can see how these two tools so far impact inflation. Okay, the Fed also still has that lender of last resort. And so when we talk about the Fed lending to financial institutions, the Fed does, we've heard bail out. Well, be careful because they're lending here. They're not bailing out per se, but we can see these are in billions of dollars, right? Billions of US dollars. It didn't start off very highly, but notice that the lending, especially when we get here and here, in terms of recessions, we can see that banks will borrow from other banks or borrow more from the Fed. The other tool that the Fed can use is the required reserve ratio. Remember, this is how much banks must, by law, hold against the deposits that they're bringing in. So if the Fed, just looking at reserve requirements, if the Fed decreases reserve requirements, the required reserve ratio or required reserve ratio, if they decrease the required reserve ratio, it means that banks can loan out more money. So that's going to increase the money supply. And as we increase the money supply, that's going to decrease the value of a dollar. Going to take more dollars to buy the same amount of goods and services, which is going to increase the price level or inflation. This would be the opposite effect if the Fed raised the required reserve ratio. A relatively new tool is interest on banking reserves, or IOBR. Here's where the Fed is going to actually, those reserves that they have to put aside at the Fed, they started paying interest on them. So it's an opportunity cost, right? So if the Fed is going to pay you an interest rate of 3%, let's say, and you can loan it out to people at 5%, then you're absolutely going to loan it out to households, right, in the form of loans. Because you're a bank and your whole impetus is to make money. However, if the Fed increases this interest rate to say 6%, then what's going to happen is banks are going to want to hold more in reserves at the Fed. That's going to decrease the money supply, which is going to increase the value of a dollar, which is going to decrease the price level or inflation. Okay, this is probably one of the most used between this and open market operations, the first one that we've used, but they're relying a lot more on this one than they have open market operations as they had in the past. There used to be only 3 tools prior to the Great Recession, 2008. Some of the biggest issues about controlling the money supply are right here, okay? Because the Fed does not control how much you or I choose to hold in banks or in our mattress. And it can't advocate how much commercial banks or any bank can choose to lend out, aside from using the required reserve ratio. And that will affect all banks, not just one bank. So They don't have precise control, but they do have some control over the money supply. We see runs on banks, and notice that it's not an old idea. We're seeing runs on banks in 2007. We saw a lot of them, if you've ever watched It's a Wonderful Life, right? There's a bank run, and those runs on the banks between 29 and 33 basically decrease the money supply by 28%. We know if you decrease the money supply, what happens to the value of a dollar? Goes up. Okay. And we know then that inflation would go down. So we'd have some deflation. But this is huge. I mean, 28%, huge. So now I want to share a video with you. It's about 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And it's pretty pertinent, relevant. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see.
Here's the G7, a group of 7 of the world's advanced economies, including the US, UK, and Japan. And here's what some call the alternative from the developing world, the BRICS, formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS is trying to position itself as the voice for emerging economies and challenge Western dominance of global affairs. Its leaders held a summit in Johannesburg to discuss an historic expansion. More than 20 countries formally applied to join. The group decided to admit 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and Argentina.
The expansion of BRICS could definitely boost the group's global influence.
Let's look at what an enlargement means for the alliance and its ambitions to shake up the global political and economic order.
The original term BRIC was actually coined by a Goldman Sachs banker, grouping these really different countries together because they were so fast growing.
The leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, and China formalized their relationship in 2009 and invited South Africa to join the alliance a year later.
They decided to take that idea in an effort to create a bit of a political and economic counterpoint to what's perceived as the Western hegemony of the global political and economic spheres.
The BRICS countries together make up more than 40% of the world's population and almost a third of the world's GDP. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, the bloc has already overtaken the G7 nations' share of the global economy on the basis of purchasing power parity. That's when the purchasing power of different currencies is equalized. Projections by Goldman Sachs show the world's economic balance shifting towards the BRICS and emerging economies. China is expected to overtake the US as the world's largest economy by 2050, with India climbing to number 3.
China and India have experienced massive growth since the BRICS were founded in 2009 and certainly have helped them swell in importance and remain relevant on the global stage.
China and Russia are pushing to enlarge BRICS. Experts say Beijing is keen to create an alternative grouping to counter the US and the West on the world stage.
China has been bullish on expanding BRICS for some time, and they're particularly keen at the moment because of the trade tensions with the US. The US looking to diversify its supply chains away from China.
Russia sees an expansion as a way to gain more international allies following its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. South Africa and India publicly support the expansion, as does Brazil. But experts say behind the scenes, Brazil and India prefer a more measured approach.
It seems that they are concerned about the group leaning too autocratic, so they want to have very specific requirements for admission to make sure that there's a balance amongst the members and that it doesn't become sort of the autocratic G7.
One reason for joining the BRICS is gaining access to the bloc's new development bank. Since its founding in 2014, the bank has approved more than $30 billion in loans for development and infrastructure projects.
Access to funding from this bank, which seem to be having more favorable terms than a traditional development bank like the World Bank or the IMF, is definitely something that's attractive to a lot of countries.
The new development bank also wants to deepen the use of local currencies instead of the US dollar for trade and financing between the BRICS nations. Ultimately, experts say one of the biggest challenges for the BRICS to counter the West is to form a united voice on major global issues.
Generally, the countries have pretty diverse and diverging interests in politics, on security issues, and even relations with the US. It is actually, I think, quite impressive that they have managed to work together so well so far.
The 6 new BRICS members will officially join in January 2024.
The other tool that the Fed can use is the federal funds rate. And this is the overnight loans that banks can make to other banks. So when we look at the federal funds rate, we tend to call this the risk-free rate or real rate of interest. You've heard that before. The federal funds rate, again, it can make these overnight loans. And it was funny, one time I was watching Ozarks, and the whole idea of putting money into an account because, what's his name? Not Barney. Because he knew banking, he said, well, you're going to have to loan up at the end of the night in order to make sure that you don't get in trouble with the Federal Reserve. So loan up is the idea of if you have any shortfalls over in your bank, you must loan it up in these overnight loans. So this is why, banks have to close out every night and then send that to their branch. That branch then goes to their Federal Reserve bank. And then if there's any shortfall, that bank has to be loaned up, as it were. Here's the effective funds rate, some prime rates, and kind of how they look in conjunction. And they were pretty, if you look at this portion of the graph, they're pretty consistent and tight here. But if you look here, the effective federal funds rate was 0. Okay, we actually had 0 bound. And there was a lot of discussion about that among economists about how that was working. And it was because the prime rate and so on was so very low, and the 30-year fixed mortgage was so very low right after COVID. Okay, let's see how all of this works. So here we have the federal funds market. Here we have the federal funds rate, right? Or the risk-free rate, same thing that we've been talking about. Down here, we have the quantity of federal funds, so how much they have available to it. Here we have the supply of funds by the Fed. Here we have the demand for loanable funds. Right here we have an interest rate or the risk-free rate of 1.5, and we have federal funds here. Now, let's say to target the federal funds rate, Fed sells government bonds. So remember, if the Fed sells bonds, then what are they going to be doing? If the Fed sells bonds, they are taking pieces of paper, sending them to households in exchange for money. So the selling of bonds will decrease the supply of federal funds, shifting this inward and to the left to S2. We're going to end up with a higher interest rate and a lower quantity of loanable funds. Okay. There, that's much prettier. Let's look at it that way. Okay, this is the end of this particular learning objective. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And our next objective, we're going to take a look at, actually, this is the end of this chapter's objectives, but we'll move on into the next chapter and talk a little bit more about these in the quantity theory of money graph. Thanks for your time and attention. Have a great day.